Hello, my friends. Today we will dive into the spooky journey, where I will share real, terrifying experiences of priests and fathers. But before we start our story, I would like to ask for your support by subscribing my channel, so that I can keep making more horror videos for my dear friends. And thank you so much for your support. We just hit 100 subscribers. I adore every single one of you. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. The Final Judgment. My name is Father Romeo, and I never thought that a pope's last words could be so terrifying. What I'm going to describe happened a few years ago when I was asked to oversee an exhumation ceremony at an old cemetery in Richmond. This cemetery was rich in history and contained the remains and relics of numerous significant religious figures. However, what happened that night permanently altered my perspective on the paranormal. It was a calm evening with a clear sky, and the air was cool but not cold. The ceremony was simple. The remains of a pope who had passed away almost 500 years prior were to be exhumed and moved to a recently constructed cathedral in the city. But something didn't feel right from the start. The cemetery was serene, but it seemed to be carrying an unexplainable burden. As we got closer to the central chapel, the air became heavier and a feeling of unease descended upon the group. The ancient gravestones were covered in moss, and a light mist hung over the ground. Although the exhumation went smoothly, an unusual cold wave swept through the area as the coffin was raised off the ground. Amazingly, the coffin's wood was still intact. We opened the coffin to examine its contents because it was pristine and unaffected by the effects of time, which was impossible after centuries. There was no body inside, just a heap of ashes and a small, worn, leather-bound Bible. It was unlike any Bible I had ever seen before, with a Latin title that read Final Judgment and text that was smeared with what looked like dried blood stains. As we studied the book, faint whispers started to come from the shadows around us. At first, they were hardly audible, but as they got louder, they changed into muffled cries. Words in Latin filled the air, repeating the Pope's name. Then, the wind picked up and swirled around us as if it were alive. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure standing close to the ruins of an old chapel wearing a dark cloak. It approached us through an unnaturally purposeful gate at the cemetery's edge. Its presence was so overwhelming that everyone froze. A few yards away, the figure came to a halt and a deep, gruff voice filled the air saying, "You shouldn't have touched the book." The voice was both internal and external, resonating within my very mind. I felt a sense of dread, like I had never experienced before. The figure kept moving forward, and as it got closer, the mist surrounding it thickened, obscuring its features. Suddenly, with a loud crash in the darkness, the chapel door behind us exploded open. Beyond the door, on an empty altar lit by the moon, was a golden crucifix. It appeared normal at first, but as I got closer, I saw something really disturbing. The crucifix was twisted at the ends, and the figure of Christ was warped as if it were writhing in agony. I felt extremely uneasy about this scene, as if the item itself was cursed. The Pope's last words were not ones of forgiveness, but of condemnation, because he knew that his death would expose what should have remained hidden. You are part of this. And before we could react, the cloaked figure appeared next to the altar as if by magic. Its voice was now a whisper, but it was still strong enough to drown out all other sounds. We left the cemetery with an unshakable sense of being watched, and the following morning the book was gone as if it had never been there. None of us mentioned the cloaked figure again, but I couldn't help but feel that something had been awakened that night, something that was beyond our comprehension, because the cemetery had been abandoned after dark locals. No one is brave enough to re-examine the strange events surrounding the exhumation, but I am plagued by the memory of the twisted crucifix and the cloaked figure's menacing words. Whatever was revealed that night was not intended to be found, and I fear it is far from over. Burden of lost souls. My name is Bishop Carter, and I served in the District of Everglades for many years. During that time, I experienced many situations that tried my faith, but none were as terrifying as the night I was called to St. Peter's Cemetery. It was a chilly winter evening, and the full moon cast an eerie glow over the ancient city. A group of cemetery caretakers approached me, clearly shaken, and told me about strange things that happened in the oldest catacombs, including whispers calling their names. Despite their fear, they thought I was their only hope as they heard footsteps in deserted hallways and shadows that appeared to follow them. The cemetery was constructed over the ruins of a 17th century convent, and the catacombs beneath were a labyrinth of forgotten corridor doors and tombs. I arrived at the cemetery just before midnight with two acolytes who insisted on going despite their obvious fear. As we entered, the silence was deafening. Not even the wind stirred, and the nocturnal birds were conspicuously absent. It seemed as though the entire place had been suspended in time, and the closer we got to the catacombs, the heavier the air became, making it difficult to breathe when we eventually descended into the underground chambers. I started saying prayers after lighting a big candle. The stone floors creaked, and the small hallways were wet and moss-lined. As we descended farther, faint whispers started to reverberate through the passageways. At first, they were vague murmurs, but soon, several voices spoke simultaneously in a language I couldn't understand. One of the acolytes grabbed my arm and pointed toward a shadow that appeared to slither along the wall like smoke. But despite our fear, we persisted in our prayers. At the center of the catacombs, we discovered a small chamber with an ancient altar surrounded by extinguished candles, and the stone floor was marked by odd burned symbols. The whispers then reached a deafening crescendo that I couldn't understand, as if the walls themselves were screaming. As we went farther, we heard faint whispers that were repeated in an order suddenly. The candle I was holding went out, leaving us in complete darkness. As an overwhelming presence closed in, the acolytes muttered desperate prayers. It was something invisible but definitely present, circling us like a predator. "Why are you here?" A deep, venomous booing reverberated throughout the chamber, making it difficult to breathe. I lifted my crucifix and started to recite the exorcism of St. Peter's the Archangel. The presence reacted violently, causing the air to vibrate with its fury, the walls to twist and writhe as though alive, and an eerie scream to pierce the chamber after an hour of praying and fighting unseen forces as abruptly as it had started. The chaos stopped. The shadows vanished. The air became breathable, and the candles surrounding the altar mysteriously rekindled in the flickering light. We also noticed a Latin inscription on the wall that had previously gone unnoticed. "Those who defile this place shall bear the burden of the lost souls." Since that night, the whispers and shadows have ceased, but the cemetery has never felt the same to me. We left the catacombs in a hurry, shaken but unharmed, and the following morning I returned with a larger group of clergy to carry out a purification ritual. As I think back on that night, I still question if those were the voices of lost souls or something much darker. Whatever it was, I know deep down that it wasn't prepared to be faced, and maybe never will be. The children of grave. There are many mysteries and secrets in Melmon, a quiet suburb outside of Washington, but none have haunted me as much as this one. The municipal cemetery, which is known for its age and history, became the scene of an incident that still keeps me up at night. My name is Father Williams, and what I'm about to share has been lingering in my prayers like a shadow. It all started when a woman, her eyes red with tears, came to the parish and said that she had been hearing children laughing late at night for the past few weeks. At first, she dismissed it as the mischievous behavior of the local teenagers. But the final sentence had a strange, sinister tone that made her shudder. I made the decision to look into it along with an assistant. I arrived at the cemetery at around 9 o'clock p.m. The place was empty except for the wind's occasional whistle as it rustled through the trees. As we moved through the cemetery's narrow paths between the graves, the atmosphere became heavier. The oldest part of the cemetery, where the headstones were worn and covered in moss, seemed especially forbidding. It was there that we first heard a faint, muffled laughter that was unmistakably that of children, coming from a far-off but unavoidable location. My assistant gave me a scared look, but I reassured him that it was just the wind. We continued, but the laughter became more audible and distinct, as if it were now all around us. When my flashlight illuminated one of the oldest tombstones, we noticed that it had frozen. I called out to see if anyone was there, but there was no answer. We made tiny footprints in the wet earth that led to a broken headstone. They were too tiny to be those of an adult and looked new. As we got closer to the grave, the air became cold, as if the world's warmth had been drained away, and I started to pray, asking for protection, when all of a sudden we saw them. Dancing shadows between the tombstones, a figure stood by one of the graves. It was small, pale, and had an air of deep sadness. Its hollow eyes stared at us, and its head tilted slightly to one side before we could react. It raised one hand and pointed to the grave beside it. Slowly, I approached and read the inscription on the headstone, which marked the resting place of a young boy who had died decades ago along with his classmates in a tragic accident. The figures were childlike and moved too quickly for us to follow, but they disappeared before we could get close. The laughter stopped, and the eerie, deafening silence replaced the laughter. I hope my prayers gave those souls some comfort, but I'm not sure if they were able to find the serenity they were looking for. The Melmoan Cemetery continues to be a place where the past and present appear to blend together, and the eerie sound of children's laughter serves as a reminder that some stories never really end. The Mass Grave. Arizona's Glorious Hills Cemetery is well known for its rich history and architectural beauty, but it also has a darker reputation, particularly in its oldest section. I visited the cemetery at night after a group of believers claimed to have seen strange things there. Stories about unexplained lights, footsteps, and, most unsettling of all, a purported procession of spirits appeared at midnight. I came to the cemetery by myself, carrying only my faith and a flashlight. It was a chilly night, and a thick fog turned the silhouettes of trees into spectral figures. According to reports, the procession began in the cemetery's oldest section, where forgotten graves were overgrown with vegetation, and the headstones were worn down by the time I proceeded cautiously, silently praying as I went. The only sounds were the muffled crunch of my footsteps on the gravel, and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. The creaking gates seemed to protest my entry as I stepped onto the sacked grounds. It was as though the cemetery itself knew I was there. By 11:30 p.m., the atmosphere changed as the temperature dropped and a subtle, odd smell, a blend of withered flowers and old incense, permeated the air. I heard a low murmur that sounded like dozens of people praying simultaneously. My heart raced when I realized that the sound was coming from a path that led to an abandoned chapel at the far end of the cemetery. At the top of the path, I saw something I will never forget. A faint golden light flickered in the darkness like a candle swaying in the wind. A few moments later, more lights appeared, forming a line that moved slowly along the path. I was feeling more and more uneasy as I moved slowly toward the source, feeling as though invisible eyes were watching every step I took. I could see human shapes in the light from these ghostly candles, but they weren't your typical people. Their faces were hidden by shadows, and their attire was outdated. They walked in silence, as if they were stuck in an endless march at the processions, in styles I had only ever seen in history books or paintings. The woman in front of me was dressed in black, her face obscured by a veil. She halted and turned to face me, but I couldn't see her eyes. I could feel her gaze pierce through me to assist us. Her voice was distinct and clear, but her lips never moved, and the words stuck in my head. Since then, reports of the ghostly procession have stopped, but I frequently question whether I actually assist those spirits or if I only contributed to something much greater than I could ever understand. Many people thought those souls wandered the cemetery waiting for a dignified farewell. I held a special mass at the location, blessing the graves and praying for the peace of the lost souls. Echoes of the past. My name is Father Arthur, and my life was forever altered by what happened to me at St. Francis's Cemetery in Houston. A young seminarian who seemed extremely uncomfortable, almost as if he didn't want me to accept the assignment, asked me to perform a special blessing on a particular grave after a family reported supernatural disturbances, believing that something otherworldly was disturbing their loved one's sleep. Around 10 o'clock at night, I reached the cemetery. The gravedigger who escorted me to the site looked anxious, his steps hesitant, as if he feared the very ground we walked on. The place was covered in a dense mist, and the silence was so profound that I could hear my own heart pounding. When we arrived at the grave, I saw that it was unremarkable, just a simple headstone with a name that was hardly readable. But before I could start, I felt like invisible eyes were staring at me. I started the blessing by sprinkling holy water around the site while I recited the prayer. But then I heard a faint sound behind me that seemed to be something scratching the ground. The gravedigger had vanished without saying anything, leaving behind only damp grass. I continued the blessing, but the scratching became louder and more urgent, as if something was trying to claw its way out of the ground. Then I noticed a shadow forming in the mist. At first, it was formless, but soon it solidified into a grotesque figure, with eyes glowing a deep red. Its shape was not quite human. It was tall and twisted, and its presence radiated a malice so intense that it felt like it would crush me. The air changed, becoming heavy and almost suffocating, and then suddenly becoming warm despite the chill of the night. As I stood clutching my crucifix, the words, "You shouldn't be here," echoed through me from a voice that seemed to reverberate from every direction. Even though I was terrified, I continued to recite the prayer of St. Michael the Archangel in a steady voice, and the figure circled me rather than backing away. As it studied me slowly, the ground seemed to tremble with each step, and the air thickened with each movement. It said, "He is mine," in a tone full of rage. "You cannot take him from me." Suddenly, an invisible force attempted to rip the crucifix from my hands, but I held it firmly. I continued to pray, each word bearing the full weight of my faith, and the shadow made an unearthly sound that seemed to pierce my very soul despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. My prayers continued to resound, growing louder. The gravedigger reappeared after what seemed like an eternity, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He told me that he had hidden among the tombstones, hearing footsteps and whispers all around him. Together, we completed the blessing and left the cemetery without turning around. The following day, the family reported that the strange phenomena had stopped, but the experience left me with a lasting impression. Ever since that night, I constantly remind people that there are places where darkness hides, waiting for the right moment to strike St. Francis's Cemetery. The young saint. A young saint named Lucario came to Virginia for a priestly conference many years before he became pope, and during his visit, he asked to see the city's oldest cemetery, which was already a historical relic, with graves dating back to the 17th century and headstones covered in moss. This story was told to me by an ex-bishop who swore with the utmost conviction that everything he recounted was the absolute truth. According to him, that a naturally curious man, he wished to pray for the dead and bless the sacred ground. On the third night of his visit, after the last mass of the day, he chose to go to the cemetery alone, claiming it was to meditate and seek divine inspiration. The statues of angels and saints were also worn down by time, despite the place's beauty. According to the accounts, he arrived at the location at approximately 10 p.m. with just a small lantern and a rosary. He started his prayers by kneeling in front of an old stone cross in the middle of the cemetery. At first, everything appeared to be peaceful, but then he heard a faint, almost undetectable, but distinct voice, or perhaps several, muttering in unison. Lucario looked around but saw nothing, so he decided to ignore the sound, thinking it was his imagination, and continued praying, but the murmurs became louder and more distinct, and he could make out words in Latin phrases as if someone were attempting to communicate. Adui liberanos venum, help me free as forgiveness. At that moment, he felt an unexplainable chill, as if the cemetery's soul had awakened, and one figure appeared out of the shadows. It was a man of noble descent, wearing old clothes, and he had a look of great anguish on his face. He pointed to a particular grave before vanishing in spite of his fear. When Lucario got close to the tomb, the inscription said it belonged to a bishop who had been excommunicated for heresy centuries before that. Lucario prayed for the bishop's soul while kneeling in front of the grave until dawn the following morning. He then told church officials about what had happened. They had approved a mass in the bishop's honor, offering formal absolution. And from that day on, no voices were ever heard in the cemetery again. Years later, when Lucario became pope, he referred to that experience as a turning point in his spiritual life. He felt that night he had been an instrument of God bringing peace to a tormented soul. But he never set foot in Virginia again, saying that even though the experience strengthened his faith, the voices of that cemetery still echoed in his mind during his quietest moments. The rich ghost. I've never felt so afraid as I did the night I was called to look into the paranormal events reported by the cemetery's caretakers, including whispered voices calling specific names. Manhattan is a bustling metropolis full of life and stories, but at night the atmosphere around St. Alfred's Cemetery changes completely. The silence is unnaturally dense, almost tangible, as though something greater is watching every visitor. Shadowy figures and phantom footsteps reverberating through deserted hallways. One of the guards, who was obviously shaken, told me that he had seen a dark silhouette standing at a mausoleum's entrance, watching him, and he was determined to find out what was going on. As usual, I chose to explore the cemetery by myself. Armed only with my flashlight and my faith, I entered and was greeted by a chilly wind that weakened my resolve. I looked at the neat rows of tombstones and the statues of angels and saints, whose eyes seemed to follow my every step as I walked, echoing in the deep silence and adding to my uneasiness. When I finally reached the spot mentioned in the reports, a group of ancient graves surrounded by a rusted iron fence, I froze when I shone my flashlight on the central mausoleum. The heavy iron door was slightly ajar and swayed faintly. The colder the farther I went, the more I felt as if I had entered another realm. As I crossed the threshold, a deep, guttural sound broke the silence. It was a low, rhythmic breathing, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the realization struck. Despite every instinct telling me to go outside, I wasn't alone. The faint glow from my flashlight showed dusty altar and ancient niches, but there was no source of the noise. Then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps coming from behind me, and I spun around to find nothing but emptiness. I started praying out loud again, gripping my crucifix tightly, but the air became unbelievably heavy, making it hard to breathe. Then I noticed a shadowy figure moving in the far corner of the mellum, unlike any natural shadow. The shadow stopped as if held back by an invisible barrier, and the atmosphere became suffocating as though the cemetery itself was waiting for my next move. Eventually, the shadow began to dissolve, retreating into the deeper darkness of the mellum. The silence that followed wasn't consoling. Rather, it was an I've silence, as if the entire cemetery was holding its breath. Its form was human-like, but its face was featureless, just an empty void that radiated menace. "You disturb my peace, now you will pay for it," a voice whispered, faint but dripping with malice. My mind froze for a moment, deciding whether to respond or to continue praying. I departed as soon as I could. I told a local priest about my experience the next morning, and he told me an old story about the tomb. It belonged to a wealthy man whose soul was said to be restless because of his many betrayals and wrongdoings in life. Many people thought that he still wandered the cemetery bound to the location where his guilt was buried. Since that night, I haven't heard anything more from the guards or visitors, but the oppressive silence I felt there still haunts me, like a piece of me is stuck there. The fearless priest. The cemetery of St. Mary in New York State has long been shrouded in tales of hauntings. Some say it is cursed because of ancient rituals performed there long before it became hallowed ground. I never gave these rumors much thought until the night I made the decision to look into them for myself. I arrived at the cemetery just before midnight. The sky was overcast with no stars in sight, and a cold wind made the iron gates ominously stand slightly ajar as if inviting me in. I pushed the gate open and I started exploring the grounds with just a flashlight and my crucifix, and the first sound I heard was a dry crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. The old tombstones were covered in moss, and many of them were tilted or cracked, evidence of years of neglect. The farther I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. After a few minutes, I reached the oldest part of the cemetery, where dense vegetation nearly concealed the graves. I stopped and looked around with my flashlight, but everything seemed normal. I initially thought it might be an animal, but the shape was too tall, and then I noticed a shadow moving among the gravestones as the noise repeated louder and closer this time. The most terrifying aspect of Too Human was that the shadow moved without following the beam of my flashlight, as if it had its own life. My heart raced, but I persisted in my search for the source, and eventually I arrived at an abandoned melon at the cemetery's edge. The air was even colder here, and my breath created clouds in front of me. My first reaction was to back away, but I forced myself to stay when I heard the faint but distinct voice say, "Leave." The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dim interior lit only by a faint flickering glow. A single candle burned on the floor near a tomb, its flame dancing erratically as if disturbed by an unseen force. But what really frightened me was the shadow inside. It wasn't just a shapeless blur. It had formed and stood tall with the outline of a human figure, but its face was empty, a black void that seemed to consume all light around it. I started to pray aloud as I reached for the door, and as I continued to pray, the shadow began to shrink and fade, and after what seemed like an eternity, it vanished completely, leaving the room silent and dark. The candle had extinguished itself, and the oppressive atmosphere started to lift. I left the melon as quickly as I could, my hands shaking when I told a local historian about my experience. The shadow hesitated, its edges wavering, but instead it moved toward me, each step deliberate and menacing. The following day, he clarified that the Mosum was part of a family that was well known for using occult rituals to try to communicate with the dead. The patriarch, a vicious and power-hungry man, had passed away inexplicably, and many people thought his soul was still trapped in the Mosum. Ever since that night, I have avoided St. Mary's Cemetery, but I still think about the shadow I saw in my prayers. I think it was a tormented soul trapped between this world and the next, waiting for something or someone to release it. The restless spirit. As a priest, I had heard a lot of stories about the Rogan Cemetery in a small rural town in California. Some of them were fictitious, while others were more disturbing. However, one story in particular stood out. Entire families claimed to have heard Latin prayers in the early morning, seemingly coming from a single grave. This was unusual, but not impossible, so I made the decision to look into it and perhaps perform a blessing. I arrived at the cemetery in the late afternoon as the sun had sunk below the hills, and it appeared as though the shadows splaying across the graves absorbed the orange light. As night fell, the cemetery seemed to come alive in an unnerving way, with each grave seemingly holding secrets no one should ever know. The family had shown me the area where the sounds were most frequently heard, and I stayed there until the last rays of light faded and darkness engulfed the area. I only heard the crunch of my footsteps and the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind as I walked through the cemetery. My body froze when I heard it for the first time, a low, horror voice murmuring as though reciting something in an old language. I knew it was Latin precisely as it had been explained to me. I stood while someone or something was praying, using my flashlight. I moved slowly along the path while still attempting to find the source of the sound. As I got closer, the voice became more distinct, and I could hear it coming from beneath an old, weathered tombstone. My thoughts wavered between faith and fear, wondering if I was being tricked or if my imagination was playing tricks on me. But the voice persisted, repeating a ritual prayer in a clear and concise manner, as though someone were begging for forgiveness. I chose to pray in the hopes that it would bring peace to whoever or whatever was there. But as I prayed, an unexplainable happened. The temperature dropped, my flashlight started to flicker, and the voice changed from a calm one to a frantic, desperate one. The words were impossible to understand, as if they were speaking in two voices at once. And then my flashlight abruptly went out, leaving me in complete darkness. I felt as though an invisible force was holding my body, and then I saw a translucent male figure kneeling over the grave with his hands clasped in prayer and his lips moving. I asked, whispering the same frantic words, "Who are you?" I did not imagine a response, but the figure paused and faced me directly. Its eyes were dead but filled with an overwhelming sense of sorrow. It raised one hand and gestured towards something next to the grave, and I followed it, finding a small crucifix in the grass. As I picked it up, I felt a strange warmth radiating from it. Then the figure vanished. The silence returned. My flashlight flickered back to life, and the extreme cold quickly disappeared. The following day, I looked into the grave's history. I found out it belonged to a priest who had died during the Great Depression recession. He had been accused of treason by the church and buried without a proper funeral or formal absolution. I talked to the local church, and we held a funeral for him. I've carried the crucifix I found as a reminder of what happened since that night. The prayers in Latin have not been reported again, and I think that spirit may have finally found the peace it sought for decades. Haunted Cemetery. When this occurred, I was a young priest in Ohio. My faith was unwavering at the time, and I thought nothing could ever scare me. But what I experienced that night permanently altered the way I view the world and the paranormal. A bitter wind sliced through the streets like blades on a chilly January night. A distraught family came to me and begged for my assistance, claiming that strange things were occurring at a relative's grave in St. Larry's Cemetery. They said they heard cries at night and were afraid that their loved one's soul had not found peace. Despite their skepticism, I agreed to go because it was my responsibility as a priest. And when I got to the cemetery at about 11 p.m., it was empty. The tombstones were enveloped in darkness, and the dim glow from my flashlight created eerie shadows on the weathered gravestones. As I entered the hallowed grounds, an inexplicable weight settled in my chest. Something wasn't right, but I continued walking toward the designated grave until I heard a sound that stopped me cold. I heard a brief, human-like scream, but I couldn't see anyone, so it must be the wind. I tried to ignore my fear, but the sound kept getting louder and more heartbreaking, like someone pleading for assistance. When I finally arrived at the grave, I noticed that the tombstone was cracked, as if time had been especially harsh there. I knelt to pray for peace for the soul buried there, and for any restless spirits nearby. But as I recited the sacred words, the crying changed into a wail of agony that seemed to come from everywhere. Suddenly, my heart raced and my mind tried to think of logical explanations, but then I felt cold, unnatural hands grip my neck. The pressure was unmistakably real, as if an unseen force was attempting to suffocate me. Panicked, I started to pray aloud, shouting the words with all of my remaining faith. Suddenly, the hold on my neck broke, and I was left gasping for air. The cemetery was silent once more, but this time it was oppressive and suffocating, as if everyone was watching me. I ran, and didn't turn around when I got to the cemetery gates. I had the feeling that something had followed me out, but I didn't have the bravery to check. I've never been back to St. Larry's Cemetery at night since that experience, and the sound of that somber cry still echoes in my head. Whatever happened there wasn't of this world. If you're ever unfortunate enough to hear someone crying at St. Larry's Cemetery, my only piece of advice is to pray.